So the last of our three economic indicators that we want to discuss is unemployment. So before we really get into unemployment, while many of you might be familiar with what unemployment is, or you've at least heard of it, we need to define a few things. So the first thing we want to define is this idea of the labor force. The labor force, when we're talking about unemployment, is just all people who are either employed or unemployed. Well, again, what exactly does it mean to be employed or unemployed? And we want to define these things not based on what we might know, but based on, well, who does the government consider to be employed and who do they consider to be unemployed? So the government considers anyone to be employed, somebody that is 16 years or older that did any work. And we mean at least 1 hour of work as a paid employee within the past week. So within the last week, 16 years or older, at least 1 hour of work as a paid employee. Unemployed is anyone that's 16 years or older who has had no employment but has made efforts to find work within the last 4 weeks. Now, this is the most important part of being unemployed. Unemployment isn't everybody who just doesn't have a job. It has to be people who have been actively seeking work. They have to have been looking for a job within the last 4 weeks. So we'll look at that a little bit more in a second. But what about someone who isn't looking for a job? Well, we wouldn't actually consider them part of the labor force. The labor force, again, is people who are either employed or unemployed. And we say in order to be considered unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work. Well, what does it mean to be actively seeking work? Well, the rules are that you have to have sent out a resume or been doing interviews. It doesn't just count like if you say oh, I got online and looked at, Indeed.com for jobs. That's not actively seeking. You have to have been taking steps within the last 4 weeks in order to find a job. So who else isn't included in the labor force? Well, who are the people who are automatically not included? Well, that would include military members. And again, military members, it is nothing against the military. It's just that wouldn't accurately reflect the health of our economy. And what we mean by that is the size of the military or people who are employed by the military is dependent not on the health of our economy, but decisions being made in Washington, D.C. And so therefore, counting those or not counting those people wouldn't really it doesn't affect our economy as a whole. We also don't consider people under the age of 16 or people who are institutionalized. Institutionalized could be people who are in jail, people who maybe are in the hospital or in some sort of long-term facility. Now, what about people who are not included in the labor force by their own choice? Well, that would be people who are students, people who are homemakers, so stay-at-home parents, people who are elderly and retired, but also discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are just people who maybe they've given up looking for a job, so they're not actively seeking work. But what if there's an overlap? Some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, hold on a second, I'm over 16 and I have a job, I work, but I'm also a student. So am I not included in the labor force or am I included in the labor force? Well, what the Bureau of Labor and Statistics considers is that any labor force participation takes precedence over your non-labor force activities. Okay, so what in the world does that mean? Well, your labor force participating by you having a job, you are taking part in the labor force. And so that takes precedent over those non-labor force activities like you being a student. So for any of you that are over 16 and you currently have a job, despite you being a student, you are considered as being employed. So once we do all this, how do we find our unemployment rate? When we think about that number that shows up in the news when they say our unemployment rate is 7.6%, what exactly does that mean? Well, unemployment, when we look at the unemployment rate, is just the current percentage of people that are in the labor force but are unemployed. And so the way we find that is we would say we take the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force, and then we multiply it by 100 in order to get it up to a percentage. So the unemployment rate is just the number of people who are unemployed divided by that total number of people who are either employed or unemployed. So the labor force. Because what we're trying to do is just find what percentage of the labor force doesn't have a job. So let's take a look at a very recent example. Let's look at the numbers from September of 2020. So the numbers for September of 2020 came out on October 2nd. And what it said was that the labor force, which is made up of the employed plus the unemployed in the United States for September of 2020 was 147 million people. So 147.563 million people. Now that's the number of people that were employed. But in order to get the labor force, we need to add the number of people that were unemployed. The number of people unemployed was 12.58 million people. Now together, adding up those two, that makes up our entire labor force. So our entire labor force for the month of September was 160,143,000 people, or 160.143 million people. That makes up our entire labor force. Now, the entire adult population would also include those people who are not in the labor force. That was estimated at being just over 100 million people for the month of September. So what that means is that our civilian, non-institutional population for the month of September was 260 million people. So that considers all people who are over the age of 16 years old, right? So civilian, non-institutional population. So we also are not counting in those people that are not in the labor force by choice. So what is the unemployment rate? Well, the unemployment rate, then we said, is the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. So we want to find out that sliver right there that's unemployed. We want to take that and divide it by our entire labor force. So we take the 12.58 million people, divide it by our labor force of 160.143 million people, and then we multiply it out by 100, and we find out that our unemployment rate was 7.86%. So in the month of September, our unemployment rate was 7.86%, or 7.86% of people in the labor force did not have a job. They were unemployed, but actively seeking work. So let's take a look at some of these numbers historically. These are the numbers from the past, 11 years, 12 years? The last 12 years, 2009. All the way up through so far in 2020. Now, what's really interesting is this tells a story. If you notice in 2009, we're starting to get into the midst of the Great Recession. And so you see the unemployment rate rise, 7.8, 8.3, 8.7, 9.0. And actually during the Great Recession, the United States maxed out at 10.0% in October of 2009. And from October of 2009 all the way up through really, it was the end of 2019, we saw that unemployment rate numbers start to go down into the 9s and then into the 8s in 2011, into the 7s in 2012, into the 6s and the 5s in 2014, and all the way down, we saw our unemployment rate get to 3.5% at the end of 2019. And so the economy was doing really well. And then we see that early in 2020, we saw the economy start to suffer because of the coronavirus pandemic, and you see some big old jumps in the unemployment rate. We saw that in March, 4.4%. It jumped to 14.7% in April, and then started dropping 13.3, 11.1, 10.2, and in September back to 7.9, which is a little bit more than half of what it was at its absolute worst back in April. So the unemployment rate is on its way back down. However, we can see, again, this tells a story of the economy looking at these unemployment rates. So what types of unemployment exactly do we have? There's 3 different types of unemployment we want to take a look at. The first one is known as frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is just that type of unemployment where people leave a job in order to go find another. So maybe some of you have left your job in order to find another job. That time in between is known as frictional unemployment, when you're temporarily between jobs. Now, frictional unemployment isn't any sort of type of unemployment for us to freak out about, A, because it's by choice, and B, it doesn't really measure the health of the economy. This one typically exists because people have willingly left one job to find another, and so it's not something to freak out about. We also see that we have structural unemployment. This is due to something within the structure of our economy causing unemployment. Maybe sometimes people get laid off, and they get laid off because there's a machine that has taken their job. Now, again, with that doesn't mean that our economy is suffering. It probably doesn't even mean that our economy is less productive. We actually might be more productive as a result. It just means the structure of the economy has shifted a little bit. Sometimes this can be because of some sort of mismatch within the economy as well. Maybe the workers available don't line up with the jobs available. So maybe there's some of you that are looking for a job right now. Well, why don't you go out and be a doctor? There's a need for doctors. Well, it's because the workers' skills don't match up, or the workers' requirements don't match up with the jobs that are available. We also said it could be caused by that change of technology and production as well. But together, frictional and structural unemployment make up something we call the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is that level of unemployment that's still going to exist within an economy no matter what. So The natural rate of unemployment is typically between about 4 to 4.5%. It just kind of depends on when and where we're at. It looks like in quarter 3, the natural rate of unemployment was estimated to be at 4.38%. Quarter 4 of 2020 estimated to be at 4.37%. So we're right in that 4 to 4.5% range. That's the kind of unemployment that's going to exist no matter what. Now, the kind of unemployment that we want to worry about is what's known as cyclical unemployment. You can kind of see the root there of cycle. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that's caused by those fluctuations in the business cycle, the ups and downs within the business cycle. And so the cyclical unemployment is the kind of unemployment we should be worried about. Cyclical unemployment tells us that back in April of 2020, when the unemployment rate was 14.7%, that at least like 10% of that unemployment was caused by that fluctuation caused by coronavirus, right? It wasn't just that normal unemployment that we're always going to have some of it. There was a good chunk of it that was because of a downturn in our economy. And so cyclical unemployment is equal to whatever the current rate of unemployment is minus the natural rate. So if we were to do that back in April, we'd say, okay, 14.7% minus about 4.5%. That means 10.2% of that unemployment we experienced in April was caused by a downturn in the business cycle.